Welcome. This week we have Birdman, a movie that I watched to kind of give a disclaimer a few days ago, but I got pretty busy and didn't have the time to record this because I had a lot to say, but I didn't have the time I thought to say it, so I held off. It's been a few days since I watched it, but still not terrible. I do remember a good bit of it because it was probably the best movie we've watched so far in this whole series of films. But I also kind of knew going into it I would like it because it's kind of like the one take movie. Like most of the ones that are like that to me is like, oh, Birdman, 1917. That's really the only two I know that I've seen now. I can think of like ones with like really long takes. Because there's a Haunting of Hill House episode that's like basically all one take, and that's a really, really good episode. But Birdman to me is like the one take movie where it like all looks like one continuous shot. And it was, man, it was real good. It used that one take, one shot about as well as you could. Because immediately it's just like you're not allowed to breathe because it's not allowing you to like cut for that second of like, I can take a sec back to breathe. It's like every second something is happening. The whole movie is just like chaotic, just things are constantly happening and like you're never allowed to like take a second to be like, this is nice. You're just like thrown into crazy situations for like the entirety of the 2 hours or so this movie is. But I also just kind of love that because it works so well where it's like I'm just having a panic attack because there is just so much going on here and I just can't like take a second to like breathe it in. It's just constantly hitting me and hitting me and hitting me and hitting me. Like the first like half hour or so, it was just like bad thing, bad thing, bad thing. Like you think you're finally about to get out of this one bad thing, and bam, 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 you've hit like 4 more times. You're like, okay, buddy, like, whoa, you gotta calm down. But I feel like that also kind of set itself up from the beginning when it's that first initial practice, and the one guy is just like rehearsing, and all of a sudden, like, the just light falls on his head and like instantly kills him. You're like, oh, okay, this is not what I was expecting. And it kind of branches off of that, like, how do we deal with that? And then we get to Reagan, who's just like, he's just kind of a mess, and his whole life is a mess, and it all is just bleeding into the play, which I think works really well. It's not like the deepest thing where it's like you use the play to kind of reflect the person, like the main character, but it is a thing that I very much love. And Raymond Carver is like a writer I know and like have read his things. So I was like, oh, I actually know what this person is talking about. I haven't read the specific thing it's based on, but it was like, oh, that's a name I actually recognize. But I also was kind of surprised, but also appreciated that like this movie just name dropped superheroes because it's like the antithetical superhero movie, but also like the superhero movie for the actors of the superheroes, where it's like you get stuck in this role for so long and it's like, am I just the superhero or am I something else? Because basically the whole plot is that Reagan is trying to like have his big break on something that isn't Birdman. Like he's trying to be something besides the guy in the suit, which is what everyone seems to know him for. Which was one thing I was kind of confused on, was I wasn't really sure how big Birdman was, because he looks really like Reagan is pretty old, or he looks pretty old. So my assumption is kind of that like Birdman is fairly old, but it seems like he's just kind of like intensely popular in like the culture, because it seems like everyone is like, oh, it's Birdman, it's Birdman, it's Birdman. And it was just like, he seems a little old. Like it feels like kind of one of those things where it's like the older Batmans, where it's like, the older Batman, you're like, oh, that's the older Batman. Like that's what I was thinking with Birdman. But I feel like now the way the movie kind of paints it is if it's like you saw like Robert Downey Jr. on the street, like, oh, that's Tony Stark. Even though he's done other things, but like 90% of people, that's probably a high number, know him from being Tony Stark in Iron Man. it was just kind of it's just kind of a sad movie because but it's also one that's like I kind of feel like we're gonna see with MCU superheroes. It's better now because a lot of them came from like not necessarily like better films, but they kind of came from these like really indie things and then moved over to superheroes. So I guess we're kind of seeing like the at least right now we're seeing the inverse of it. I think because I think it's a lot of like these really big like actors and actresses in their own right are like moving over to the MCU and it's like this will be their project. But I think there also is a little bit more freedom to like do other things on the side because like the people that have been in the MCU are still in like other things. But I also think there's that kind of potential for them to get stuck in the MCU where it's like all you're doing is the MCU, all you are is this character. And I imagine a lot of the actors and actresses now are kind of like that's the thought in their mind is like, am I going to just become like Spider-Man or this, and this? Like, am I going to become this character for the rest of my life? And I think that's kind of what Reagan is just very scared of. Is like, am I just Birdman? Like, I don't want to be just Birdman. I want to be something better. I want to like do other things with my life. And it's kind of, it's like a happy, like, yeah, I think you should do that. But the movie kind of makes it feel so sad, where it's just like Reagan's life is falling apart, and he's just really trying to like do something else. But it also is just him kind of afraid of that past, or that past is still like eating at him. Like Birdman is still present and is like basically taken an entirely new personality on inside of Reagan, where it's just like this is just kind of sad to see. But it is interesting to see how it kind of everyone bounces off of him because he is like there's the Reagan the actor in the play, there's the Reagan the dad, the Reagan the Birdman, and they all kind of just like feed into each other that just kind of make his life worse. Because it's well, there's also the Reagan presumably pre-Birdman, where like Reagan's got some anger issues and a half because they mentioned that like he has already tried to kill his wife, which is like, oh, red flag, that's not good. And it's also pretty clear he has some anger issues, pretty bad ones considering he just like wrecks a bunch of stuff by the end. But it also kind of is portrayed as like that's the Birdman, where it's like the superpower kind of doing it. He's like, which I took to be as like Birdman, so maybe it is just like Birdman is kind of making that problem. But I also think it's kind of deeper than that. I thought it was originally that it was like they were gonna explain it as like, oh, we had a really traumatic past, and he's like, just kidding, I lied. And it's like, oh, I guess we don't need to know that. But it's kind of like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And they're like, just kidding, I was acting. And I was like, yes, you were, because I didn't get it. But, man, it's just like it's a chaotic, it's just kind of, all in all, just like a downer movie. But it's also like technically like really good. Because the one shots just work so well. It's just like immersing you in that, just like, ugh, like I just feel bad. And it's just it takes a toll, but then I like take a second to step back and I'm like, man, this is all one like looks like one continuous take, and I think that's really cool. Moving on to more, we'll get to our Emma Stone bit here because she's not really in this a whole lot. She's just kind of like a stoner kid who just does not have a good relationship with her dad, which is her dad being Reagan. Because like Reagan, he like tries, but it's like very clear that it's not really like working for either of them. Or it like kind of is, it kind of isn't. And it seems like by the end they kind of make up, but then the end happens and you're like, well, guess that's not getting fixed. It like kind of is fixed, but it's like there was a better way to do that to fix it, but also in the context of the plot. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. We're like 5 minutes too late on that happening. But Emma Stone kind of kills it. With the like stoner vibe, just kind of like that listless, just vibing through life. And I'm like, man, that's really great. But I feel like the walking through life is kind of just permeating through like every character. Because I think this whole movie is just like people who want something, they want to be like relevant or like accepted, or they just have this very specific want that all of them are like rooted in and really want to get to, but none of them are at. Whether it be like Reagan just wants to be successful again, like, or be relevant. Edward Norton's guy wants to be like successful. He wants to like be in the theater of it. Wants to be like a cool guy. And then it's like everyone is just kind of rooted in that they are trying to be something, and life is just like, nope, you're not that right now. Like they all just kind of got dealt bad hands in a sense, but like they're still trying to get the hand they want. And some of them kind of do, but we don't really see that. And then some of them is just like they're kind of trapped. Like, will we ever really get out of here? And we don't really know. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. That's beyond the scope of the movie. It's also interesting, like as a film, because this is like a later film. I think it's like 2015, maybe, where it's like kind of the advent of like social media and kind of like being 2014. Like it's kind of that beginning of the emphasis, like being relevant, like social media wise. Because like Reagan's like final thing is like he becomes popular on social media because of his like like the first one where he's just running around the city in his underwear, and the second one, which is, I guess we'll just get like the spoilers of it all, where he just literally shoots himself on stage like with a real gun, which I was fully expecting to be the end, because the scene was that Reagan's character comes in and is like, "Why are you cheating on me? I just wanted to be this," and the wife is like, "I don't love you anymore," and the guy's like, "She doesn't love you anymore," and Reagan's like, "Guess I'll die," and so the whole point is he like shoots himself, but it's like a fake gun, it's like blood. He like spits out, and you're like, "Oh, he's okay." And the last time it's like you see him grab like a real gun, and then he shoots it, and you're like, "Oh, is this movie just going to end with him having killed himself live on stage?" And you're like, that's not my favorite thing. It is a power move, but not in a good way at all. But then we find he doesn't actually die. He just like blew his nose off, which is like weird. Like we don't see how like where he shoots, but it's still like, I don't know how that looked, considering I feel like he would just do what he did every other take of it. But I guess not. Maybe it being a real gun kind of changed it. I was expecting the end though that he would kind of wake up and you're like, oh, he like destroyed his nose. I was kind of expecting like a bird nose of like him just becoming like Birdman, because that's kind of what I like. The vibe I got by the end was that like the Birdman aesthetic had just like consumed him. Like he was now Birdman, and then like he flew away. In a sense, he dreamed he flew away, and he actually just jumped out of a window and died. And you go, yep, that happened. That's really depressing. But in hindsight, now that I'm kind of thinking about it, I think that is the better way to end it, or end the film at least. It's not like the suicide in general, not great, not my favorite plot device. But like in terms of his character, it's kind of like, oh, he has become Birdman, so to him, he just thinks he is flying, but he is gone and he is now dead, which is just kind of sad. But it's like he walked out on a high point. He was social media relevant, made a big big debut, blah blah blah, just like living life. He was successful for a brief moment, and then he died. And you go, rip, dude. Just it feels like it's hard. It's like technically good, but it like sits with you, and you're just like, man, that is not. Doesn't make me feel good. And I don't know. It's just not. It's hard to describe, because it's like technically I'm like, yes, this was good, but I'm also like, suicide is bad. So I guess we're gonna kind of sit in that little limbo, because I don't really have a good answer to like how that ended. But I do think it was a more fitting end than it happening on the play. But I don't know. Suicide, not great. Wouldn't recommend. Bad times, bad times. Go find help first. That will hopefully help you. I think in terms of the movie as a whole, it was the one I enjoyed the most, but in like a masochistic way, but not like a math. That's probably the stretch of the word. Where it's like I was enjoying the chaos, but as I kind of you could see the pieces start to unravel, and it was like, oh no, we're going down here. I was like, I don't really feel so good. Mr. Stark, I don't feel so good. I don't really want to go down this route, and then it kind of does. And you're like, well, the one thing I did note that was just like interesting though about his like initial where I thought he was gonna die initially was that like on stage like he shot himself and then the like whole crowd is just applauding at him and I'm like they don't know. I just want to see like the aftermath of that because it's like you're all just applauding at this and then it's like oh he's not getting up or like oh he's like in immense pain. There is a lot of blood. Like there is his skull or something like that, which is definitely like way too gruesome. But it's like, how would you respond as an audience to that? Because it's like there was like the slap at the Oscars, which is like the people kind of laughed at, but it's like you're applauding at this, and then it's like like it kind of. I just want to see that instant where it like hits, where everyone's like, oh, that was not fake. Like, but I think it's not really relevant to the movie. Like, it doesn't really matter because the movie's kind of about Reagan. It's just one of those things that I'm like, man, I would love to see them just like how to respond to that situation. Because if like that happened to me and I like was clapping, I would just feel like immensely just like full body like gross. Because it's like, oh, I was applauding him for doing that to himself, which is like not the way you should be doing that. But I also feel like I probably would clap because everyone else is clapping, and I'm not gonna be like, oh, why am I not clapping? It's kind of weird. But yeah, that was just a little thought I had where I was like, oh, how would that look? Other one I had was on music. Was music for this? I think also kind of heightened that chaos and that like just like anxiety kind of frantic feeling. It also made me kind of wonder like I don't think Uncut Gems would work like this type of movie because it kind of goes around too much. But I do kind of wonder what that movie would look like if it was like shot like this because that movie is already like immensely stressful to me. And I feel like if you just didn't give me that second to breathe even more than like it already kind of doesn't, like would I just have a heart attack watching that movie because it's just like on level 1,000 of just like chaos and stress and just not good vibes that are just consuming your body because you're like, what am I supposed to do? I can't like move. Too much is happening. I'm scared. I need help. And at the end, I kind of had a little realization because I watched this on like Tubi, which was like free. So there were ad breaks, which was like, by the end, I was like, I could use an ad break right now. Like, I need like 15 seconds to just be like, just like take a deep breath and like take a load off for like 5 seconds to just let myself process that. But also, that is not at all what they intended. They did not intend me to be watching this movie on my phone with ads playing. But it was appreciated. I appreciated the ads, even if they were not great ads. They were just kind of boring. But overall, I like really enjoyed this. Like I was expecting to enjoy it. I figured it'd be pretty good because I've heard a lot of like really good things about Birdman, and I think movies that are like meant to like one continuous shot are like really interesting. because it's like, how do you do things like change time or change locations or do this and this? Like, how do you tell a story told over multiple days or like multiple times without making it seem like an overt cut where it's like, oh, we've gone through the day? Because one thing I thought was really interesting was how they did like the day and night cycle, which is where they would essentially just like pan up the sky basically and then have like basically a time lapse of like, oh, time has passed. It is now the next day, which is simple, but I'm like, that is a good way to do that. Because I think it differs from something like 1917, where it's basically just like one like continuous instance of like a day or two, basically, where it's like the whole point is this is just one mission. They are have to get to here to there in one day. Whereas like this is a story that takes place over multiple like opening night or not opening nights. It was like practice. I'm not like the most well versed on theater. This is a brief tangent. So my understanding was that it was like preview shows, and then the last one that we saw was the opening night, which I think is what it was. But the crowd seemed like more full than what I think of like a preview night. But I guess I also like haven't seen that many like big stage shows. I literally saw my first one like yesterday, but that was like a Broadway musical. Like that is a size comparison that is not going to work with a Raymond Carver play that is not something as many people are going to know about as something like Hadestown, which is what I ended up seeing. But that's really just like my ignorance on theater and not really a problem of the movie. It's just like, I don't really know how this works. But I didn't appreciate seeing the like play itself like happen. But I also thought they did a really interesting thing where it was like going through the days and it was like this final scene looks drastically different on each of the like I think 3 times we see it, because the first night it just doesn't work because Edward Norton's guy is just like, this isn't real. He's just like pure. It's just like, yes, I'm not feeling this. This isn't working. He's just drunk and like, he's pissed. And it all just kind of falls apart. And the second one is one where Reagan comes in his underwear and just like uses like finger guns until he gets like on stage. It's like it like kind of works with the scene, but it's also like, we know that it's not intentional, but it was still like kind of neat. And then the third one obviously is where he like gets the real gun and shoots his nose off, which is just like, imagine going to see that if you like got permission to see those like all 3 days, just like how tonally different it would be. Is like the first day doesn't even finish, the second day it's like this guy is shut up his underwear, and then the third day like, oh, he has shot himself in the nose, and you're like, what is going on here? Like, what is this play supposed to end like? Which, and you see how it like ends, supposed to end, but it's also just like, what is gonna happen on day 2, on like the second show that this is actually going for? Like, what's gonna happen? Because the entire time is like the cast and just like the entirety of this play is just a mess and a half. Like, it is walking on knife's edge the entire time, where it's just like, these people are going to crash and burn, or something's going to happen, and they're going to be okay. Because Reagan is just like losing his mind. All his relationships are just kind of hanging by threads. They're being sued because the guy didn't die actually when he got hit by the light. And it's like every 2 seconds something is like a hair away from just falling apart in its entirety. And that, I think, is what really makes it frantic. Is like, there is nothing in this play that I would consider secure. Whether in this play or really in the movie in general, like, there is nothing here that I don't think, like, one little misstep would just bang, this whole thing is falling apart. Everything is just crashing and burning and crashing and burning. And it's like, well, that's a fire right there. I'm going to try and not get messed up with that, because otherwise I'm going to be having a bad time. And I mean, it in reality, it does crash and burn, considering opening night guy blew his nose off. That guy's now dead. Who is basically one of the main guys. You need an understudy there. I don't think there's an understudy there. There's a lot of money that is probably going down the drain, or it's just not going to be seen. And it's like, man, this is a disaster and a half. But at least you got opening night. The review's out there, and that's something. But also the review is kind of like dicey, because the review is like, oh, it's gonna start a movement, where it's like, I don't think someone actually like physically harming themselves on stage for like effect should be something we're encouraging. Like, it's definitely something different, but that's not sustainable. Like, in the long term, you can't be injuring yourself that much every time. And is it just like, oh, that kind of allure of like, oh, is he going to do it this time? Is this going to be the show where it's real? But then also, like, doing that is like, oh, if it's saying being shown 20 times and there's going to be one time where he actually injures himself, you've now more than likely cut the entire runtime of your thing short. Because it's like, if Reagan came back after blowing his nose off, it's like, nothing's going to top that anymore. And more than in reality, he's going to be in the hospital for a while. So it's like, you can't really do the play that same effect unless you were just willing to get like 40 people that are willing to blow their noses off, which this play does not have the money for. That is ethically, liability, legally, just probably illegal. Actually, I'm going to say it is illegal, considering that is putting your actors in physical harm intentionally. You are intentionally trying to hurt them. Even if they consent to that, I'm like, no, maybe you shouldn't do that. That seems like a little not okay. And by little, I mean a lot. But thankfully, that's not how it is in reality. If someone gets injured, that's a problem, and we address that. We don't encourage it. And I'm glad we don't. I think that's about all I have to say about this movie. It was best one so far, I'd say, which in the last few weeks is not hard to do, but technically it's easily the best. I think it just is the best overall. Like, I think Easy A is probably second, but I feel like those are two entirely different things. And to me, even Easy A is kind of like a similar to a lot of other things, where it's like, this is a kind of, not cliche, but there's kind of like a basis for its existence, whereas like Birdman, there's definitely like a basis for its existence. Like, there are other movies like this, but I feel like a lot of them are not in this style. And I think I also just kind of prefer self-destruction stories, which maybe that's a red flag, but I feel like it's something I've kind of noticed a lot with myself, especially in like romantic literature, like Anna Karenina, and like I can't think of the other one, like Stephen Crane, I think it is The Awakening. That might be the one where there's just kind of something like alluring about watching these people just like downfall and just spiral into just worse and worse and worse, where it's just like immensely engaging. But maybe that might just be a me problem, that I need to be like, oh, is that something I'm concerned about? But I also just think it's enjoyable storytelling to kind of watch people just lose it. Like, they're trying so hard to like get something they want, or just like be something, and then it just ends up unraveling everything. And I just think that's really cool. So overall, this is number one pretty easily. I think we're gonna settle back into the lull of like okay movies in the future, but I don't actually know. Honestly, I've looked at these movies that we have to watch, and I don't really have any way to tell which ones are gonna be good or not. But I'm excited. I definitely needed this movie to kind of get me to want to watch more of them, because I was like, man, I'm just sick of bad movies. So maybe I'll just do that. pick the ones that look good and spice them between the ones that look just awful or look like something I'm gonna have a mediocre time with. But I don't really know which movie's next. I'm still kind of just flying by the seat of my pants, picking a movie, and I'm like, I'm feeling like watching Birdman tonight. And then I go watch Birdman. I'm like, yeah, that worked. I'm glad I did that. So as a whole, good movie. Would recommend. I don't know what it's on streamer wise because it was on Tubi for like 2 more days, so it's probably somewhere in the internet or you need to rent it. But I would definitely recommend watching at some point. But I think that's all for me this time. I don't know what movie's coming next. You'll see when the episode comes out next week. That's all from me though.